Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I'm going to be doing another continuation of the previous two videos concerning Torah-based conversion, and this one's called Who Gets to Decide? Okay, so in this video, which actually I thought the first two videos were going to be the last ones I did, like I mentioned, but another good question came up, and I decided that I needed to maybe follow up based on that question. Um, And again, before I get into the actual what the question is, let me first repeat something that was mentioned in the previous two videos. The written text of the Torah, the five books of Moses, the Torath Mosheh that we've been talking about. In the written text, there's nowhere in the text where it explains how, a Jew, for example, is to respond to someone who decides they want to be Jewish. It doesn't explain the process of making someone into a Jew, someone who joins the Jewish nation, the Israeli nation. There's nothing there that talks about any of those things. The only thing that the written text of the Torah talks about is once someone is considered to be a ger, which is a ger is someone who has joined themselves to the people of Israel and is essentially Jewish. Once that happens, it doesn't explain how to make them a ger. It doesn't explain the process of accept them. And in fact, there's no mitzvah that says a Jew has to make someone into a ger. There's no requirement in the Torah for the Jewish people to go to the world and make the world Jewish. There's no commission of any type for that. And there's nothing that says, okay, well, go out and, if somebody wants to be a, Jew, make them a Jew. There's no mitzvah that says that. The only mitzvot, that are there are how to treat someone once they are a ger, because again, you're dealing with someone who has left, a nation that they were a part of in some way and has joined the Jewish nation. I mean, of course, someone, walking into something like that would need support and they would need certain protections, in a society that they're not from, in terms of their birth and family, things like that. So if there's no description of a requirement to make someone Jewish, and if there's no description of how to make someone Jewish, the question that someone easily may say is, well, where do all the Jewish laws come from in terms of how to do it? Well, the first step, for example, is that there are elements of the Talmud, for example, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, things of the Mishnah that are mentioned there and also in the Torah. But even there's no one like checklist that has gone through and said, okay, this is what you do, A to Z, or Aleph to Tav, to make someone into a ger. There's different mentions of it here and there. So this leads into the question that the person asked me, and they were basically asking if the methodology shouldn't it be the way that the Talmud mentions about Hillel. In the Talmud in Shabbat 31 Aleph 31a, there's a story that mentions a particular group of Geirim who got different responses when they went to different Ramanim at the time, concerning their desire to become Jewish. Now, I'm not going to get into the full story because, again, one of the problems with the story in terms of someone reading it is that it's couched within a number of different what's called Gemarot, Gemaras for the in that part of the Talmud. So a person can't skip to that one and then read it and say, this is what should be done, without reading all the previous stuff before it. Because one of the things a person finds out is that in that particular area, the main focus of the discussion or the stories that are there are not really conversion themselves. One of the things that is discussed is the difference between the school of Hillel, or at least Hillel's perspective, versus Shammai's perspective, and how they handled different situations. Now, the basics of the story is that someone wanted to convert, they went to Shammai. Shammai turned them away, essentially, in a certain way because of what they asked. The thing is that some people forget in the story is that the thing the person asked is a bit of a stretch, if you will, in a sense where they wanted to accept the written Torah but not the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So meaning it's like saying, I want to accept this written text, but I don't know how to read it and don't know how to apply it. I don't want any of the application stuff. I just want the written text without the application and the understanding of the text, which, Shammai had a certain approach and he drove the person off for something like that. Essentially, Hillel, presented the person with some scenarios that made it clear that there's no way the person can understand the written Torah without an oral Torah. As an example, the person says, okay, it's like, okay, I'll teach you how to be a Jew. The first thing you need to understand is the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, such and such. And then the next day, he says it in a different way. And the person's like, hey, wait a minute, didn't you tell me something different yesterday? It's like, oh, well, if you're going to have to rely on me for the Aleph bit, meaning the letters of the Hebrew language, you're also going to have to rely on me on the fact that there's a written and an oral Torah. And that's the shortest version of the story. I'm not going to get into all the details behind it. But this is one of the things that has to be understood. Now, someone looks and says, well, Hillel's approach, because the story ends with Hillel essentially being, his approach being raised up from the perspective of the people who were Geirim in the story, those who wanted to be Jewish and eventually became Jewish. But the important thing that you have to understand about any Talmudic story is that the story in itself is not in a vacuum, meaning that the story itself is not something where you just take that little story, pluck it out, and say, ha, here we go, this is what we're getting from it. One of the things that has to be taken into account when we're dealing with Hillel and Shammai, at the time that they lived, they were like the top of the top in terms of people who understood and taught Torah. So this is like saying that these are the best experts, the all-stars of the Torah of their generation. So think about this. Imagine someone goes up to a Jew who's just a regular Jew off the street, and let's just say he's a rabbi, but he's just like a rabbi who, let's say 10 minutes earlier became a rabbi. He's not really known. He hasn't written anything that people know about, but he knows Torah and Halakha to the best of his ability. A person says, okay, I want to be a Jew. And, we discussed in the last video how the Halakha determines how that person is to be approached in terms of they're checked to see what their intentions are. And if there's no ilah, meaning no issue found with them, then there's an approach that's given. And I dealt with this in the conversion video, and I won't go over that again here. But go back to the conversion video, and I just detail the process step by step based on what the Mishnah Torah has in it. So imagine someone off the street being approached about someone wanting to convert, knowing nothing about the person, and having to start from zero to be able to determine. And again, this is someone, let's say, who became a rabbi 10 minutes ago. The person may need to go back and look at some sources. The person may need to ask a lot of questions. The person may have to think about something. There's a lot of considerations that have to go into, for example, bringing someone to a nation, accepting them at border control, if you will. So that's the first thing. One of the requirements is that you have to have three, experts in the Torah as a part of what's called a bet din in order for the person to go through a conversion. That's the basis of the halakha. So one rabbi by himself can't just decide, okay, well, I'm going to make this person a Jew, we're done. It doesn't work that way. There's a lot of considerations that would have to go into that. Now take that rabbi out of the picture. He became a rabbi 10 minutes ago. And insert a person who's been a rabbi, who has been a knowledgeable rabbi for let's say 30 something years. Let's say for 30 years, you have a rabbi who's been through the Torah numerous times. He's been through the halakha numerous times. He's learned from some of the greats from the previous generation. He's been a rabbi for 30 years. Compare what his insight would be to the person who only became a rabbi 10 minutes ago. That's a different perspective. So the person who's been involved in that for 30 years, a person comes and says, hey, I want to convert, they may have less things to consider. They may be able to make some pretty quick decisions on things based upon that level of experience. So asking someone who's like a regular rabbi or even a rabbi who's been a rabbi, let's say 5 years, compared to someone who's been 30 years, you're going to get a difference in the views and the understanding of the perspective, especially if the rabbi who's been a rabbi for 30 years has done 30 years worth of conversions, rather, compared to a rabbi who has been only doing it for like a few minutes or a few years or whatever. So that's one thing to consider. So Hillel, Shammai, these were the top of their generation. So saying that somebody approached them is a pretty big deal. It's not like anybody today, because we don't have anybody on the level of Hillel or Shammai in this generation, not at the moment. At some point in the future we can, but we don't at the moment. So a person would first have to understand, okay, based on this story, I can't use this story in my example, because if a person's approaching a rabbi who's not Jewish, you're not the person who approached, Hillel several thousand years ago, because Hillel lived about 2,000 years ago. Further to that issue, we don't currently have anybody, rabbis who are at the level of Hillel right now. And this brings me into the second part of the story. The other part of the story that's important to take into consideration is that the person who approached Hillel in the story, which is in the Talmud, was someone who, for example, was in the land of Israel. So this changes the whole perspective. If we're talking about conversions happening outside of the land of Israel now, and comparing it to a conversion that took place in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, we're talking about a completely different story, because here's the kicker. Hillel was the head of the Sanhedrin, meaning the Bet Din Agadol, or the Supreme Mosaic Court in the land of Israel at the time. We don't have a Sanhedrin right now. We don't have a Mosaic Court. And in fact, you're looking at the temple, we don't have a Bet HaMikdash. At the time that Hillel lived, there was a Bet HaMikdash. So we're living in completely different circumstances than he lived in, which will require any modern day rabbi to have to do a little bit more field work than Hillel would have had to do in his generation when there was more control over the land of Israel in a Torah-based manner. Um, so these are two important elements that would have to go into the story. Now, the other issue is that the story that's there doesn't give us a full perspective on the entire history of what happened, meaning that it basically enters into this idea that you have someone who wanted to be Jewish, but they wanted to be Jewish on their own terms. Went to Shammai, Shammai ran them off in a certain way. Go to Hillel, Hillel kind of brought them slowly into the idea that they can't just determine for themselves what it is that they get to do and what it is they don't get to do to become a Jew. And that, in a sense, if you look at it, doesn't give us the full picture of it. Did it take a few years for that understanding to come? Did it take a few days, a couple hours? The story never tells us how long that was. The story never gives us an idea of how long Hillel was dealing with this person, teaching them, because it does say that the person went back and learned. It doesn't say for how long, though. So this is one of the dangers sometimes people have when they don't really like sit down and learn with someone who's got long years of experience in these texts and in the culture, that they can come to wrong conclusions by listening to people sometimes who give them a 10-minute explanation or a 10-minute story without saying, okay, well, let's sit down and learn this bit by bit and based on sources, and that's one of the importance of finding someone who's older, who's been down this road long enough to be able to explain things in a way that makes sense and is based upon a historical basis that they also learned over years of learning from other people who learned it from previous people, so on and so on. So again, the basic issue that comes up here is that we have to rely on certain sources to describe to us exactly how the process is done, because there are certain sources from the time of the Torah, from the time of the Nevi'im, from the time of the Rishon, the Chazal, of the Rishonim, but actually I would say before the Rishonim, the Geonim, that don't give us a step by step of how to perform a Gior. That's information comes from what we're going to discuss now. An important point that I must make here, just so there's no confusion. Now, I'm not saying that the conversion itself is only, according to the rabbis, according to the Chachamim, according to Chazal, for example. What I'm saying is that the actual process itself, the source for the methodology, which is oral Torah at this point, comes from the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch as the methodology is broken down. So what that means is the written Torah doesn't describe the process. That's something that's covered in the oral Torah of how to actually approach someone who wants to decide to join the Jewish nation, who wants to become a Jew. So that's a very important point that I wanted to stress here, because I think somebody could misunderstand that what I'm saying is that, for example, the process or even the conversion itself is according to the rabbis, and therefore you can be lenient in this area. And the important thing to remember there is that the leniency concerning rabbinic ordinances is not just, okay, I decide to be lenient just for no reason whatsoever. I'm going to just do it for no reason. That's in extreme situations where a person had to decide whether to be lenient, because of an extreme situation, or to be more, strict in a situation. We regard the Torah, the written Torah, as something where we're strict in whatever it's there. If a very, you could say like over the top issue comes up, and the question of, okay, should I do it this way, or not do it? In the Torah perspective, we're strict. If a same kind of extreme issue came up in the rabbinical situation, we can be lenient in those areas, but it's just not something we just pick and choose. Okay, I'm going to be lenient today and not so lenient tomorrow. That's not the way that works. So again, the actual sources themselves for the description of the process that comes from the oral Torah is pretty much detailed in the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. So it's not just simply that I'm saying that that's something rabbinical, for example. Especially since if a person were to ask, okay, well, the Bet Din, where does it say that a Bet Din has to do this? Isn't it just like three Chachamim, that can do it? Well, if we go to Mishnah Torah, for example, I think I covered this in the conversion video. So if you go through the video I did about conversion, I cover this. But in Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Isura Bia, Perek Yud Gimel, the Rambam explains the following, and starting at the top right, of course, and he basically explains Ger shemal velo taval, ol shetaval velo mal enu ger. So he's basically explaining that if you had someone who, I guess you have a questionable situation, so someone says, okay, well, I did Brit Milah, but I didn't, go in the mikvah, or they went in the mikvah but they didn't do a Brit Milah, the Rambam says this person is not a ger. And he says further, Ad sheyumol v'yitbol. So essentially what he's saying is until they do whatever they're lacking in those two areas, whether if they're missing the Brit Milah, the Milah, essentially then you do that. If they're missing the tevilah, meaning that they went to a mikvah, then you do that, and then they're not considered a ger until they did that. So in the yellow, starting at the very top, the top left, he says, "V'tzorich litbol bifnei shlosha." So what he says there is that they need to do the tevilah in front of 3 people. Now here's the next part that's a necessary requirement to understand what he's talking about here. So in the green, you see that he says, "V'ho'il v'davar tzarich bet din." So the Rambam specifically says you need a bet din for that. So the 3, and according to the descriptions of what he means, is basically explained by others as being that the 3 that are being talked about here is the bet din. And how do we know that? He further explains, going to the yellow. After that, he says, "Ein matbilin oto b'Shabbat v'lo b'Yom Tov v'lo b'Laylo v'im hitbilihu harei ze ger." So essentially, he says that the tevilah in the mikvah doesn't happen on Shabbat, and it doesn't happen on a Yom Tov, and it doesn't happen at night. And basically says that once, if they've, done the tevilah, as soon as they've done that, that person's a ger. So that's like the ending of the entire process, for example, for him to do the tevilah in the mikvah. So going in the green right after that section, he says, "Ger katan matbilin oto al dat bet din." So that's where the bet din part is in the red. So each time that the word bet din shows up, I put it in red. So to end off, he says, "V'zechut hi lo מעוברת שנתגיירה בטבלה, אינה בנה צריך טבילה." So let's just finish that point that he's making here about someone who's a katan, who's like a kid, for example, someone who's young, who's considered below the age where they would understand the Torah. As an example, let's say somebody adopts someone, eventually, they have to be made into a ger, for example, someone who's not Jewish who's adopted. Or a family, let's say a family converts and, for example, they have children. Well, the children, have to also go through the tevilah, and that's also by the bet din. Now, going further down into the next paragraph, what he says, "Lefichach lo kiblu bet din gerim, kol yemei David u'shlomo, b'yemei David shema min hapachad chazru, u'b'yemei Shlomo." So here he says that during the time of David HaMelech and also Shlomo HaMelech, during King David's time and also King Solomon's time, that the Bet Dins didn't, bring in Geirim. They didn't make Geirim during that time, the Bet Din. And it's also in red here, Bet Din. He says Bet Dins. So he's not just simply saying it's like 3 people who are Chachamim and that's it. He's saying this is a Bet Din. So going further, he says, "Shema bishvil המלכות והטובה הגדולה שהיו בישראל חזרו. שכל החזר מן הגויים בשביל הדבר מהבלי העולם אינו מגרה צדק." So essentially what he says here is that the concern was that during those times there was a if you will, political advantage to wanting to be Jewish because of the fact that David and Shlomo had a very Torah-based stable malchut, meaning a Torah-based kingdom here in the land of Israel. So the concern that the Bet Dins had at that time was that this is just someone who may want to say, okay, well, there's an advantage to me being Jewish, and I'm only doing this for the advantage of it. I'm not concerned about, so Hashem, I'm not concerned about Torah. And he says that these people who would do it for that reason are not considered a Geret Tzedek, meaning that they're not considered real Gerim. And continuing the yellow, he says, "V'af al pi, alfa pi ken, hayu Gerim, harbe mitgarim, v'yamei David u'Shlomo, bifnei hadiot." Now, I mentioned this in the previous video I did about conversion, the longer one. Not the one recently, but like I think it was like almost maybe, let's say a year ago or something, maybe a year ago, where essentially what he says is that during the time that this was happening, when the Bet Dins were not doing Gerim, not bringing in Gerim, that there were all kinds of people who were made Gerim by like regular guys off the street, someone who knows the written Torah, Hediot, who knows the written Torah but isn't very well versed in the halakha to where they can make judicial judgments about it. So he says that these people brought in Geirim, and that's exactly what he mentions later as being, a potential issue. And in fact, he says here going in the green, "Wahayu bet din hagadol choshishin lahem." So he says that the bet din hagadol, meaning the Sanhedrin, was concerned about this, and basically like the people that they made into Geirim, the bet din hagadol didn't fully trust them, and kind of, it says choshishin, feared about them, because it says do dochin otan. אחר שתבלו מכל מקום, ולא מקריבין אותם עד שתראה אחריתם. So essentially what it says here is that the Bet Din didn't fully trust them until it was able to be established that what they were doing was something, was for the right reasons, and that it was like essentially that they could be considered Geirim correctly because the Bet Din, had to like kind of see if they were doing the right thing. I mean, it'd be almost like someone saying, okay, well, a regular person made this person a citizen of the country. Well, immigration might look and say, hey, okay, we have to look into this because we can't fully trust that this person knew what they were doing when they made this person a citizen. And you find this all the time with immigration, that there are people who, for example, hire people who are illegal immigrants to a country for work. There are people who, for example, may marry someone to help them get immigration status. And the immigration, on a national level may have to get involved and say, okay, let's make sure that this is something that's real. Let's make sure this person has the right to work. Let's make sure this person has the right paperwork. Let's see if this person entered the country illegally. Let's see if this person is marrying for the right reasons. Are they just marrying just to get a citizenship and then they're out of there? These are things that are checked by immigration, and essentially the Bet Din Agadol and even a regular Bet Din are dealing with this issue. And if you look in the Mishnah Torah and other places, the Rambam does explain that, for example, a person who, let's say, does Avodah Zarah, who is not a part of the Jewish nation and wants to come into the land of Israel, he says that doesn't happen. If they were doing Avodah Zarah, they're not allowed in until they keep the Sheva Mitzvot and Noach. So you could imagine that during the time of Malchut, that if someone were to try to come and say they want to be a ger, they would first have to get to the border and be able to say that they have, that they first give the Sheva Mitzvot or Noach before they can even do anything. And according to the Rambam, that's done by Bet Din. Bet Din is the one who has to determine whether or not, that a person could be considered a ger toshav. And also, the interesting thing there is that the Rambam says that only happens like during the Yovel. So it's almost like once every 50 years would that even be allowed to happen. So again, the main thing here is that the process as it is today is a valid process. And again, it doesn't mean that every person who does this does it with the right kind of attention to detail and concern. I mean, there's some Bet Dins you can go to, and they might just simply say, okay, here you go. Here's your status. You're out of here. And in some cases, they may not even have any contact with that person ever again. I think there's very few Torath Mosheh or Orthodox Bet Dins that would do it that way. But because of the fact that you have different movements out there that are doing whatever they're doing, that's exactly what the Rambam's saying. They have someone who's a Hediot, bringing people in, and essentially what happens is it makes the entire Jewish nation responsible for them. And again, that doesn't mean that there are people doing, the people themselves, that people who want to be Jewish are doing it for the wrong reasons. What it simply means is that the people bringing them in some cases, are doing them wrong and doing them a disservice. And I think I've told stories about this where, I knew some people who converted through, like, let's say the Reform movement or the Conservative movement, and they weren't fully told in a way till they could understand that their conversion wasn't accepted everywhere. I know someone who was going around claiming to some of the Igbos in Nigeria that the reason why they weren't being converted by the Orthodox is because the Orthodox are racist. And in reality, it was simply the Orthodox didn't even know anything about the Igbos for the most part. And in order for someone to get go to a Bet Din that's Orthodox, you'd have to be able to approach a Bet Din that's Orthodox. And the Igbos at the time didn't have that. But this person who was saying this was Reform. And I remember them telling me this, that the reason why they were involved to help the Igbos was simply because of the fact that they wanted to prove that the Orthodox were racist. It had nothing else to do with like the Torah. They didn't care about whether or not the Torah was being kept by the Igbos correctly, whether the Torah was even understood. They just simply wanted to say, okay, I'm helping this group here, and I want to prove that the Orthodox are racist. So that's the thing that has to be important here, that a Bet Din is necessary because of the fact that you're dealing with someone who would know what kind of questions to ask and what kind of things to do. And in the area where someone could say, well, I don't like the idea of like testing someone. Well, again, the Rambam mentioned, as I showed in the previous video, and also all the videos I've done on this issue, is that the Rambam says, according to halakha, and the halakha even says in the Talmud that they have to be checked. So again, how do you check someone? In some cases, a person may say, okay, I don't like the fact that you're testing me. Well, that's how you check sometimes. Sometimes the way that you see where someone really stands on something is to test their resolve, and that's up to the discretion of the Bet Din. And again, a person may say, okay, I don't like that, but this is actually explained in the Mishnah Torah that the right to be able to do the Torah, the way that it was given at Har Sinai and the way it's been passed down by the Masoreth, essentially is to the Jewish people. It's not to someone who says, I would like to be a Jew, but you have to do it on my terms. And even the Hillel story we talked about earlier, that also is covered in that story where the person goes to Hillel and says pretty much like, I want to do it my way. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm going to teach you these things. And then when he like teaches it a different way the next day, the person's like, hey, you taught me something different yesterday. He's like, well, if you're going to rely on me for like the letters of the alphabet, the meaning the letters of the Hebrew language, then you're going to have to rely on me for everything else too, meaning that you have to believe that there's an oral Torah, and that I'm the one teaching you exactly based on the processes here. And again, I want to stress very importantly here that, again, as I said before, the Torah, the written Torah, is part of the story. I mean, it's almost like the Cliff Notes, because the written Torah is the basis for all of the things that Jews do in Jewish society. But the written Torah itself does not make any specific requirement that the Jewish community must convert someone when they have an interest. Um, it makes no designation for that. What it does say is how to treat someone after they've converted. And that's where a person has to love the person who's converted and treat them with respect and provide for them. Because again, they're leaving another nation and joining the Jewish nation, but it doesn't say when someone comes to you and says from another nation, I want to be a Jew, it doesn't say you must convert them on the spot. It doesn't say anything about that, and that's what I've been dealing with in these last few videos, that the Jewish community, has the choice and the ability to decide who, how this process is going to work. Specifically in areas where the halakha doesn't like clearly define it, it's up to the discretion of the Jewish community. And at the moment, just like it's described here, we just saw that a bet din, made up of 3 rabbis nowadays, is the process that pretty much every ancient Jewish community holds by in terms of being the people to go through and do this process. So what that means is you may say, okay, I don't like the fact that this Ashkenazi rabbi told me that I have to go before bet din. I don't think he has the authority. Well, again, who are you to say that? I mean, you're just coming out of nowhere saying that, and you don't have the Torah basis to be able to say that he doesn't. And at the same time, every ancient Jewish community holds the same way on this issue. So if you go to the Teimanim will say, okay, there's a bet din right over there. Made up of 3 rabbis. You can say, well, I don't agree with these Teimanim. Okay, well, here's the Moroccans over here. They say the same thing. Well, I don't agree with the Moroccans. The Sephardim, over here. I don't agree with the Sephardim. Okay, so the question is, well, who are you to say you don't agree with anybody, and who do you agree with all of a sudden? Someone who tells you that you can convert in 10 seconds, without any kind of, forget this whole process the Rambam says. You do whatever you want, whatever you feel like doing. I mean, go jump in a cake. Who cares? That's the thing that a person has to understand with this issue, that in the modern time, it's a little bit more difficult to try to do this process because of the fact that in the modern time, most people don't have the ability to truly investigate where everybody's intention, for example. So sometimes the only way to test it is to say, okay, well, look, you don't have to be a Jew. You could follow the Shiva Mitzvot and be perfectly fine by that. There's no requirement to you to do A, B, C, and D. I mean, I see that you live in this area where there's no Jewish community there. Maybe it'd be easy for you to keep the Shiva Mitzvot Noch. I mean, because if you don't, then you would have to move to the Jewish neighborhood. And a person may say, okay, well, I don't want that. I want to be a Jew, and I'm going to move, as soon as I can. This is the timetable that I'm on. I'm looking at moving in this way. And if a person gives the right explanations, I mean, there's a number of rabbis who would accept that, but again, buyer beware. There are some rabbis who, conversion is not their thing, and there's no requirement for it to be their thing. There are some rabbis who, again, just, the way that they talk, the person may say, I don't like the way he talked. Well, he might talk to everybody that way, even people who are born Jewish, I once knew a rabbi who, had a certain, disposition, but he was a really nice guy. He just, talked a certain way, and that was just, you just have to understand that's the way he talks. And, there's some people you may say, okay, well, I don't like the way this guy talks. Well, maybe English is not his first language. That's the other thing too. There's rabbis out there who live in America and live in different countries who are not from those countries. They, came from Israel and they speak Hebrew. So you may present them with something and they may not understand exactly what you're saying because the English is not their first language. So a person has to be very aware that, again, this is not a religion. Again, I have to stress this over and over again. This is not a religion. Torath Mosheh is not a religion. It's not what people are used to in terms of religion. This is, we're talking about a nation, and the rules that apply to nations also apply here also. Because again, the major issue is that you could join another religion and do certain things and nobody's really responsible for you. It's almost like you're on your own as an individual. You join the Jewish nation, you start doing things that are against the Torah, we're all responsible for you. And we could pay the heaviest price for your actions, for example. And that for the most part doesn't exist in a lot of other things out there. In religions that doesn't really exist. Religions most of the time take you as an individual, and as the individual, you can kind of choose to do the right thing or choose to do the wrong thing. Let's say, for example, you have someone who converts to the Torah, becomes a ger, and all of a sudden they start doing Avodah Zarah, and they teach, let's say they become a teacher, and they start teaching Avodah Zarah in schools, and people are like, wait a minute, this guy's teaching Avodah Zarah to my kids. He's got my kids doing Avodah Zarah. Where did this come from? And again, this is being extreme. This is not, getting on and saying that Geirim are a problem. It's just saying if the process isn't done right, it could be a problem. And that's more in the Jewish community than it is on the person interested in become a ger. And thus, if you have a bet din, they know what to look for. They know what kind of question to ask. Hopefully, I mean, again, they're people too, so hopefully they know what to ask for. Um, and hopefully they involve the community that they're a part of and kind of saying, okay, look, do you know this person? How long have you seen them? Someone could say, okay, I've seen them going to a Bet Knesset for years as a Ben Noach. They learn Hebrew on their own. They learn Aramaic on their own. They're amazing. They come here, with me and my family and do Shabbat dinners, things like that, and blah, blah, blah. And a person, a Bet Din can say, okay, this makes sense in this situation. This person has really made a stride on their own without us having to really do anything. Or the reverse could also happen. One person's like, okay, this person, every time I try to tell them something from Torah and Halacha, they argue with me. Not argue with me like in a productive way, like Jewish argument can happen too, and it does happen all the time. But I mean, this person is like against everything I'm telling them. So I say, okay, well, you have to keep Shabbat. I can't believe you want to make me keep Shabbat. It's like, why are you here then? If you don't want to hold by Shabbat, I mean, why are you trying to become a Jew? For what reason? So again, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and I hope that is to answer the question. I believe this will be my final video on this topic. I believe, until someone brings up some question that forces me to do another video too, or which is a good thing. I don't mind. So take care.